Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at our P6 practice. Now, this project may be similar to the one that you are currently working on, or it may have features for some other project that you are interested in. In this particular video, we are going to focus on how to set up this project. We're going to talk a little bit about what the requirements are for this project and a little bit on how we're going to be able to extend this even further. So to begin with, let's talk about what this project is about. So this project is a departure from the earlier series, the P1 through P5 that you may already be familiar with. And instead, this one's going to focus mainly on file input and output. And so as we shift gears, we're also going to shift to more of a customer centric focus. In other words, what we want to do is we want to put ourselves in the role of the customer and what the customer needs. And so for this particular project, we are going to be looking at a very basic inventory management system. So imagine that maybe you are a vendor or perhaps own a small business, whether it be a web business or a physical brick and mortar store. And the idea is that you want to be able to maintain some sort of basic inventory. And one of the steps as part of that inventory management is going to be the ability to search your inventory to look for particular products. Might be for the purposes of ordering, might just be for the purposes of querying to see what you have in stock. And so to begin with, let's talk a little bit about what is part of a basic inventory. The idea is that we're going to have some sort of persistent file that will have some information in it that allows you to identify uniquely each of the products in your store. And so to begin with, we will have an ID, perhaps some sort of name, fundamentally what the customer knows it as, the type, perhaps whether it's perishable, cold, a drink, a snack, etc. The description, which we're going to leave a little more open, and you'll see why in later videos. The idea is that perhaps that's a searchable field then that allows for you to look for additional information. The price, in this case, we're just going to focus on it in dollars, and then the quantity or the number of the product that you have in stock. Now, this video is also going to be a little bit of a departure from earlier videos, and specifically this project will be in that we will only focus on the parametric mode. Now, it's very simple for us to switch this to an interactive mode application as well. So if anything, we're going to leave that as a trivial component of this project and let you handle that yourself. And so what we want to do instead is focus on the ability to search our inventory. And for instance, you may want to search it to see if you have a particular product ID, a particular name, a particular type. But we also want to be able to search the description. And in the case of the description, we may just be looking for part of the field, unlike the product ID, the name, and the type. We also might be interested in looking for items of a certain price range, hence the min and the max, as well as the quantity for the purposes of reordering or tracking your inventory. And again, for a min and a max. Now, I've given you the sample functions here, so hopefully you've gotten a copy of this file. The idea is that there are some basic steps that are going to be reproduced in each one of our switches. And fundamentally, we have to import the products first from the file. The display function allows for us to see that we have been able to successfully import them. We want to be able to copy a product from one array of structures to another. And then lastly, we want to be able to export products. We also have some helper functions that will allow for us to do things like search the structures by range, as well as looking for an exact string match or a similar string match. Now, let's take just a second to look at the products themselves, and you'll see I have a very short list here. We can build on this. You'll see that the ID is unique for all products. You could argue that this is probably not enough. In other words, it's only going to support 999 IDs. Again, we can make this as large as we need to. A friendly description of the product the type of product, and now we get into this vague description of the product. And the idea is that that field we won't use necessarily in this particular set of videos, but we will use it then in the future to maybe tell a little more about the product for the purposes of the description, maybe in a web interface or maybe even in some sort of console interface. And then the price, and then the current quantity on hand. So let's go ahead and get started. Hopefully you can sort of appreciate what we're going to be doing here. You can see here that I've copied over some of the code for the functions, as well as added then a typedef struct that simply matches those fields we talked about. The ID right now, we're going to limit to 10 characters. Remember that if we're going to treat it as a string, that only leaves us with 9 or n-1 characters to work with, which currently our ID pattern should be acceptable. The name, again, 20, type 20. The description I've made longer because the idea is perhaps we want to grow that and use that in other ways. The price is a double and the quantity is an int. I've also provided you with the help function. And so let's go ahead and get started by setting this up. We'll actually just go ahead and start with our help. Seems like a reasonable place to begin this project. And you can see I've also given you the template, if you would, for your function documentation. And we'll simply expand this. And we'll start by looking at some of the switches that we wish to cover. And so our usage line, and then a printf of our, in this case, our P6 practice. And we want to provide help. And we want to provide help in a number of different ways, not only by providing the /, but also the /h. Now, at this point, you're probably pretty familiar with this process, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. The idea is that we want to provide to our users some help about how to use our application. Now, at this point, we can probably come over here real quick and get some guidance from our instructions. And again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this for you to finish, but I am going to go ahead and simply just copy and paste the switches here, sort of as a reminder of what we have to accomplish in our main. All right, so at this point then, these are the steps that we need to follow. So the first thing we want to do is we want to look to see if the user is asked to search by ID, and then they have to have provided the product ID. And so just some quick notes here. That means that including the executable, that our argc must be equal to 4. For the product name, it also turns out that our argc must be equal to 4. Likewise, with our with our product type, our argument count is going to be equal to 4. And then lastly, with our description, even though it's a partial product description, the total argument count, including the executable, is still only going to be 4. Now, if you want to add support for the /p and the /i switch, as is done in our earlier projects, it would simply adjust the argument count and then what we will be looking for in the arguments themselves. Now, with this search price feature, you'll notice that we have both a min and a max, which means that's going to bring our arg count up to 5, and then likewise with our quantity. Now, you can leave these notes wherever you'd like. I'm going to put them down here in the help because ultimately it's going to help me create the help function. And later on, then we can add some examples as we start testing this application. For now, what I want to do is I want to focus on actually implementing this in main. And I might as well go ahead and take just a second to bring down all of the remaining functions. And again, I encourage you to go ahead and improve on the documentation, in other words, this comment block, And we're going to take just a second to go ahead and stub all of these in. Remember that you simply remove the semicolon, add the comment block. We'll come back in just a second and we will add a default return value. And then effectively all our functions should be ready to go. So a couple more here. And we'll talk about what each one of these functions do in the videos that pertain to them. Again, in this particular video, we're just going to be interested in setting up our main and essentially just setting up our application, period. All right, so there we go. There's my last comment block. Again, encourage you to take some time to go back in and fill them in. And then what we will do is we will simply create a results variable for right now. We're going to set our results equal to exit success because we are going to be optimists. And we simply return our results. And again, in the respective videos, we can discuss about what those return values actually should be, but at least this gets us started with a default value. And again, I'm just simply going to copy and paste these into each of my function signatures, or rather each one of my function implementations. And at this point, probably a good time for us to just build our application, just to make sure that we, in fact, have something that still works. Now, let's go up to our main and let's actually make something happen. And so the first thing that I encourage you to do is to go ahead and declare a couple of variables here, an index variable that we will use to loop through some of our variables, particularly our structures rather, as well as our arguments. And so the other one we're going to need is going to be our results variable for our main that is just going to capture each one of the returned arguments from our functions. And then, yeah, it's a good idea just simply to look at what those arguments are going to be. And so we're going to set up our generic loop that loops through each one of our arguments up to, but not including, our argc, and then increments by 1. And then at this point, then we simply need to print out a little view of our arguments. And so at this point, how about if we do argv square brackets and then %d is equal to %s followed by a new line. And then in that first placeholder goes the index, and that second placeholder goes our argv square brackets index. And then probably the other thing that we would like to have here would simply be a view of the argument count itself. And so we'll say argc is equal to %d followed by a new line, and then whatever the actual argument count is. Now, at this point, again, you can simply go ahead and build the application, and you can check to see that at least this much is working. We're going to come out to our command window here. And you can notice that I'm here in the P6 practice folder, and I'm going to go ahead and run my P6 practice.exe. And you can see so far we seem to be on the right track. Now, our argument structure for this particular project is pretty straightforward. The first thing that we want to do is, of course, handle the help. But then from there, we are going to be looking at our search features. So let's get started first with the help. And in this case, then what we can do is we can simply just look to see if our arg count is equal to 1 or less than or equal to 1, if that is even possible. And if that is the case, then fundamentally the user just wanted to call the help. They had no idea how to use your application, and they just simply tried to run the executable. And again, this is kind of an implicit call, meaning that they didn't intentionally ask to do it. Now, under the else if branch, what we can do is then we can start to look at the argument count itself. And so in this case, the argument count might be equal to 2, and the arg v square brackets 1, utilizing our string compare I function, may, for instance, match the slash question mark. And if that's the case, or if we would like to handle both scenarios at the same time, we can just simply copy and paste our second condition and change it to /h. And so in this particular scenario, then if the argument count is equal to 2, and that second argument is either slash question mark or /h, then basically what we want to do is, again, make a call to help, albeit this time it is an explicit call to help. And then lastly, we want to have an else branch before we go any further, and we simply have another implicit call for help. In other words, basically, we didn't triage whatever switches were passed by our user. Now, it appears as if I have some mismatched parentheses here. In this case, I think I could probably get away with removing that first one, or we can simply add a third set, whichever makes the most sense to you. But now we are ready to look at our search feature. Now, to do this a little bit different, I'm going to actually leverage some nested switches. And what I mean by that is, if you notice that our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other options for this application currently all require a search switch, and then they differ either with the number of arguments or with what those additional arguments are. But in other words, in all 6 of these combinations, we have at least 4 arguments, and we're looking for the /search as that second argument. So what we can do then is we can simply write the logic to simplify this a little bit by checking to see 2 conditions: that our argc is greater than or equal to 4, and that our string compare I matches our argv square brackets 1, which is the second argument, and that it is in fact search. And in this case, then, this handles all of the search options. So handles all of the search switch options. Now, we still have to do some additional logic, but then this will allow for us then to nest our if statements. In other words, the next set of if statements will focus only on the remaining switches. In other words, now we only have to look at the argument count and then what those arguments are. And so what we can do now is we can focus now in on argc equal to 4, and then using our string compare I, we look at our argv square brackets 2, and if it in fact matches /ID, well, that means that the user wanted to search by ID. Now notice here I have intentionally capitalized the ID. Well, if the user forgets to capitalize the ID, it won't matter because we are using the case-insensitive version of our string compare. Now, why did I do that? Well, generally speaking, most of the time when you see the ID, it will be capitalized. Again, that's just kind of common convention, although it's definitely not required. Now, moving on here, let's go ahead and put a print statement in to let us know where we are. And so in this case, I'm just going to summarize this by using /ID. At this point, we could probably go ahead and put another print statement up here, printf, calling search. And again, the idea is that we just want to generate some noise while we are building our application to build confidence that we are actually doing it correctly even before writing our functions. And so here I'm going to simply say I'm calling ID now. And then under the else if, I think at this point you probably are starting to see the pattern. I'm going to check to see if my argument count is in fact equal to 4. And if it is equal to 4 and my string compare I compares my argv square brackets 2. And in this case now for that argument, I'm going to be looking at the name or the product name. And again, what we want to do is simply provide now a print statement to the user. In this case, I'm just going to say calling /name. And at this point, you probably can see that we can get away with a little bit of copying and pasting. And in this case, now we are going to be looking at the product type for the third search possibility. And then for the fourth one, we will be looking at the description. Again, I'm just scrolling down here to look at the individual switches, just to make sure that I'm keeping in line with my help. And so there's our description. So calling /description. And then continuing on, we want to look now at the price and the quantity. However, though, if you remember that with the price, we also have to have 5 arguments. In other words, remember there's the min and the max instead of simply a single value. And so again, we want to do the same thing now with our quantity. And then again, we simply want to have a print statement that tells us that we have successfully called the right switch combination, or rather triage that switch combination appropriately. And then lastly, we have one more else where we make a call to our help function. And again, this is kind of an implicit call because the user basically just did something that we didn't expect. And so they didn't explicitly look for help, but they basically passed something that we didn't expect. Now, you probably can tell now with this nested if structure that you do end up in a situation where you got more calls to help. There are ways to get around that by using flags. But again, to keep this logic fairly straightforward and essentially pretty easily extendable, it's okay to have a few extra calls to help. Now, at this point, let's go ahead and build it. We want to come over to our command line and we're just going to test to see how our switches are working. So there's our P6 practice. And so by default, it calls the help. Of course, I need to improve the help. As a matter of fact, I tell you what, why don't we take just a second here to at least make this look somewhat more presentable. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to create a little template, if you would. And I'm going to have my search. And I'm going to let you fill in the rest of the arguments. But we've got 4, 5, 6 of them. And then for the first one is going to be the /ID. And then I'm going to specify an ID, our name, and then a name, the type, and then whatever that type might be. Description. And then again, remember that this is going to be a partial product description, not the complete product description. As a matter of fact, probably want to emphasize to the user that it would go in quotes. We'll handle that then in another video about how to update then our help to emphasize that. And again, we're just going to take just a second to clean this up. And then for the last two, it is going to be the price and the quantity. All right, so let's go and build it one more time. We seem to have at least the starting point for our help. I did forget one thing. I want to mention that there is a min and a max here. And the same for the quantity. Go ahead and save it, go ahead and build it, and then come back out here to our command prompt. And if we run our P6 practice, you can see here that we have the starting point for our help. Now, we want to go ahead and explicitly call our help by passing the /, the /h, and something along the lines of nonsense. In other words, basically something that isn't reflective of a use of our application or a proper use of our application. And at this point, then we can actually test the rest of our switches. And so we'll start by simply passing search with no other arguments, which does in fact call up the help again. And then we can do search with ID, but again, we didn't provide an ID. So again, we need to provide the user with help. And then I'm just going to put the value of 1 in there. And you can see that I am calling search, calling ID, which brings us to probably one little minor thing that we should clean up, in that we did not put a new line after this. And again, we can probably just go ahead and put the new line here for each one of these. So I'm just going to do some quick copying and pasting to update this. I could also do a Control-H and do this pretty quickly, but I want to make sure that I'm only putting them in specific places. And again, you can see here that I've cleaned up the output a little bit, calling search, calling ID. We could check the same with our name, and I'm just going to put something there. And you can see, again, this seems to be working correctly. We can do our description. And again, just follow this up with something. We skipped over the type. No big deal. We can go back and check it. Looks promising. We want to do the price, and then we're going to pretend that we don't know what we are supposed to pass. And in this case, I'm actually going to pass only one value, which again is incorrect. We need a min and a max. And then the last one that we want to test quickly is the quantity, which again, we're going to test to make sure that the switches are working correctly with the incorrect number. And then again, when I do provide the correct number, I do in fact get the search and quantity prompts. So at this point, we are ready to go to start coding our individual functions. Now, again, we're going to save that for later videos, but hopefully you found this video useful, and hopefully you can appreciate and understand the purpose behind this particular application. We're going to be doing a series of videos focusing on this particular application. I'm going to be adding a bunch of features to this as we go along, because this one's just a great starting point for a lot of different ideas. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.